Chapter 38, Selez. The First Reef. The pride of the Anguis Naga, of all Naga, loomed into view. Miles of coral grew out from a giant underwater volcano like a mile-wide second skin. Its base sprang from the top of a large underwater plateau that dropped away to extreme depths. The closest dry land was a 3-day swim away. This was the domain of those who lived in the water. A patrol of manta outriders passed them, waving to the outrider Selez was riding with. He had been one of the Naga that had answered the horn at the tidal womb and had offered to assist Selez back to Nagara to help transport Bagrant's seaweed-wrapped body. The reef was always expanding, slowly, as the coral produced hard calcium exoskeletons that each generation built on. The first reef of today was orders of magnitude larger than it was at inception. The submarine caldera at the top of the volcano held the origin womb, the ancient tidal womb that was said to safeguard the very first generation of Naga. Legends said that Nagan himself had created the reef here for his children to thrive, and it had expanded ever since. First, stretching to the confines of the volcano's basin, which only just rose above the surface of the ocean in calm seas, then extending out from the volcano, at first through fissures and cracks, but then through tunnels carved by the early generations of Naga. Once the coral was freed from the confines of the volcano, it drunk in the sunlight and methodically expanded across the entire rocky surface, eventually building on itself outwards. Selez felt the smooth, rubbery top of the giant manta ripple slightly as the rider took them down over an algae farm and towards one of the large ingress entrances to the reef. A pair of pakas, giant seahorses, were seen being led by an algae farmer, dragging a large net of goods for trade in the city. A line of other farmers, tradesmen, and hunters had formed outside the entrance. The rider pulled on the reins gently and the manta rose higher. As the elevation increased, the leading edge of the coral retracted, mimicking the sloping topography of the completely obscured volcano it had sprang from. This edge of coral was still alive, and reef shapers could be seen with hands aglow, teasing and guiding the coral's formation. It was a labor of love and a highly regarded profession that required an unrivaled level of patience and dedication. It might take a year for the coral to grow 1 foot and required daily care until it passed, leaving the calcification behind. Shapers of high enough level were tasked with utilizing specific strains of coral to form homes and other structures. As the manta continued to climb, the water grew lighter as the dawn's rays were less diminished by the depth. The reef was constant motion. Schools of different kinds of colored fish wove in and among the coral. Eels poked their heads out from darkened hovels. Small crabs skittered sideways along the soft, swaying fronds of kelp. While the Naga had no qualms with eating ocean life, much of that came from farms and hunting from outlying areas. There were plenty of creatures that used the first reef as a bastion from many of the larger dangers that would never be allowed to penetrate these waters. As they rose within 40 meters of the surface, the manta leveled out. At this level, the manta rider was careful not to get too close to the coral. Only the most skilled shapers worked at this depth, as the coral they shaped was deadly. Varieties that had poisonous spines, acidic expectorant, and electrical defenses. Some could even explode into huge inky clouds that would obstruct all vision. While the first reef had never been directly attacked, there was always a chance the humans or one of the other races might discover the location. The Naga of the first reef did not fear the depths. They watched the surface. This was why no entrances were formed above 40 meters, as was the law. Selez knew the entrance the rider was heading for. It was one he had used frequently. Unlike many Naga, he had grown up in the interior. The Naga had quickly outgrown the underwater caldera, and now only older, prominent bloodlines lived there. They were expected to be the guardians of the origin womb and preserve the old ways. They formed the Nagan Council, which ruled alongside the priestesses of Ezreia. How will Mother react? He thought. He clenched his fist. It was that human's fault. If Ruth hadn't interrupted, I would have avenged Bergrant. I could have restored my honor. His fist relaxed and his shoulders slumped. The charred skin of his amputation wound throbbed. He remembered the tied sword, the immense weight that had descended on him and choked his words off when the human had shamed him, shamed them all. How? How could the god of this world take the human side? Selez had mastered the songs, had honored the ancients. He had been ready to pledge his life, die if needed in the service of his people. The scriptures taught that humans were evil, that it was their nature, that it was not a sin to take their lives. And yet he had woken to an unquestionable judgment. Achievement. Sullied. Dirty. Tainted. To be branded dishonored was enough to destroy a young Naga's future, but to be marked sullied, it meant his very presence was unclean, that he contaminated those around him. To spend time with him was to risk being marked dishonored themselves. If he had told the Manta Outrider he had been so marked, he would have been cast off the beast and abandoned. Everyone at the tidal womb had witnessed what happened, but most didn't know the full context. They left there spreading tales only of the human that had somehow shamed them and imbued a tied armament. They didn't know of Selez's larger transgressions. That Bergrant was only dead because he had ignored the orders of a Tide Lord. Well, technically only bent, he thought. But even Selez knew the truth in his heart. He glanced at the green cocoon of seaweed that was Bergrant's body. It was his fault. The manta swooped into the ingress tunnel, coming to a stop just outside a large chamber where other manta rested. The outrider offered to help Selez carry Bergrant, but he refused. Normally, the bodies of the deceased were carried by their friends and family through the city to their home shrine, but none of Bergrant's family were here. News had not yet reached the city. Selez could announce it now, but his shame silenced him. Coward, he thought to himself. Selez grunted as he hefted Bergrant over his shoulder with his one good arm. The smell of the mint weed he was wrapped in concealing any traces of decay. The outrider moved in to help, but Selez's face contorted. No! It was his burden to carry. It occurred to Selez that he had never asked Bergrant where he had lived. It hadn't seemed important. While technically any shrine could be used, it was taboo for anyone not from the caldera to be brought to the shrine of Ezreia. To reach it, he would need to ascend the interior tunnels of the volcano and climb the obsidian rise. Drown it, he thought. Muscles burning from the weight, Selez started the long climb. Being sullied wouldn't just ostracize him, but it was also a reflection back on all who had a hand in his upbringing. His teachers, his friends, his mother. They would be judged and held responsible for his shame. People would say they should have taught him better, supported him more, held him more accountable. Selez had seen it happen before. A young soldier, barely older than Selez is now, had panicked and abandoned his post during a human incursion. He had gone on the run to avoid answering for his crime, but was apprehended and returned to the first reef for judgment. When he was brought to the center of the caldera for the masses to witness, and his crime announced, Selez had heard the whispers. After the public humiliation, the soldier's sponsor retired and swore off ever teaching again. The next day, the soldier had taken their own life. At the time, Selez had thought him a coward. The least you could do is try to make up for your mistake, he thought. But now he understood. He felt it as he was marching toward an inevitable destruction of his own future. The dread lay thick around him, numbed the burning pain from the weight he carried. The worst thing was, the city was the same as it had always been. It was the day after the celestial dance, and the bioluminescent wreaths worn by revelers lay strewn about the pathways, softly glowing. The trill of Naga children playing in a nearby tunnel. A Naga acquaintance that recognized him nodding and passing, but then slowly stopping behind him to stare at the mintweed. Everything was so normal. Nobody knows, he thought. He thought for a moment to turn and leave so he wouldn't have to face her, but regardless, she would find out anyways. It was inevitable. As he stepped out from the rampway onto the next level of the city, the last before the grand rise to the caldera, he started to notice the muted, low-pitched tones that counted for whispers among the Naga, the sideways glances as he passed. That's Selez Lumenscale. What happened to his arm? Who does he carry? Some had started to trail behind him. None did him the dishonor of offering to help. The grand rise was now in front of him, a gradual slope of obsidian rock worn smooth from the passage of generations. The blue and alabaster crystal top of the shrine of Azrea could be seen rising in the distance. His shoulder had long ago gone numb, and he had braced his arm by grabbing the back of his neck to lock Grant's body in place. Selez's progress slowed now, not because he was tired, but out of fear. But his tail did not stop propelling him forward as his head finally topped the rise. The shrine of Azrea looked almost alien to the rest of the reef. Unlike the formed coral, the shrine was hewn from white quartz laced with sapphire. It was a large circular domed structure. The dome itself was steep, like an upright egg. The density of the sapphire in the quartz increased with height, and the very top reflected and scattered rays from the rising sun into light blue beams. The entrance, a mostly milky quartz rectangular addition, had no door. It was simply a 20-foot high opening that split at a recessed wall. Entrants needed to walk in and then around the wall to reach the true interior. Selez had been there many times, even for some celebrations of life, but never had he been a carrier. With each step, his dread rose. Normally, there was a priestess stationed outside. Word must have finally outpaced him, which meant they had called her. His mind started to race. Could he bend the truth? Convince her that he had the best interests of the Naga at heart? That he couldn't possibly have known the Tide Sword was legitimately carried by a human, let alone that he would be able to imbue it? Rationalizing every mistake he made, even excusing disobeying the Tide Lord's order. It had only been to return to Nagara, and he was here, right? The Tide Lord was not here to say any different. The fact that he was justifying it in his head forced him to acknowledge that he didn't truly believe it. How could I know Grant would be killed? Selez furrowed his brow skin, but that was the one thing he was most sure of. Everything else could be justified in some way, but he was leading, but Grant had followed, and now he was gone. He still thought of 100 excuses in the next 30 paces as he entered the hollowed structure. 100 ways to explain, 100 ways to plead. If only he could conceal that he had been sullied. He slithered around the dividing wall, head bowed, watching the ground just in front of his tail. The milky quartz floor started to shift into sapphire. But if she was waiting, his mother was the first of Azrea. If she looked into his eyes, she would know. He saw the obsidian, slightly raised, convex slab floor and gently placed Begrant down on his back. Selez took one clawed finger and carefully dragged it across the mintweed wrappings from head to toe. The stained cocoon separated with a sound like slowly tearing paper, revealing Begrant's pale, scaled body. His arms were crossed over his chest, and Selez's eyes were briefly drawn to the gaping neck wound that had felled him. Then Selez took a shallow breath and looked up.